really want to mimic nature and the way that that happens as much as possible, and create, your overstory layer of trees, and then maybe some smaller trees and shrubs and ground covers and all, but you want all the different layers of plants that occur in nature to be ideally in your yard.
On today's episode, we have John Romens. We talk shade canopies, soil building, plant root health and how it affects the soil, where to plant, water management and water systems, an intro to biodynamic farming, including the local scene and how farmers and wine growers are using these methods, and finally, current weather patterns and what that means for our yards and soil. Please subscribe to the Get in My Garden podcast on iTunes and other podcasting apps, and leave positive reviews if you like the show.
I think it's a joy to connect with the property that you're living on and kind of grow with that property. Hi, I'm John Romens. I'm the owner of Future Roots Regenerative Landscapes.
You're located in New Mexico, and we have a unique environment here. How did you end up moving here, first of all? And then can you speak a little bit to what particular problems that we have here?
Sure. So I'm actually originally from the Twin Cities area in Minnesota. So pretty big difference coming from the land of 10,000 lakes down to, Santa Fe, New Mexico. But I got interested in horticulture in my undergraduate studies. I was actually majoring in business and in entrepreneurial management. Just took an intro biological, sciences lab course on plant propagation and kind of a general deal, and just was fascinated by the plants and, all of their different properties, and kind of went with it from there. So then I ended up double majoring in horticulture and business. Yeah. And then
I think that's really interesting to a lot of people who are listening, because my podcast has been focused on people doing creative businesses that are focused on the earth. My personal question was always like, how are we going to get people to understand what, more sustainable methods of landscaping? So when I learned about what you're doing, I thought that was really interesting, particularly like what kind of conversations you're having about what you're doing with your customers.
Right. So kind of the, biggest thing right off the bat, as far as New Mexico and the high desert and all of that is we have pretty thoroughly depleted soil from, various things that have been happening either via human activity or just, over time. My starting point with a lot of customers is to address the soil. We kind of have a ground up philosophy, if you will. Things need a good substrate and good biological activity and diversity in the soil in order to get a jump start in this pretty harsh climate and landscape that we have. So that's kind of the starting point, is, really taking a look at the soil. A lot of times it's been almost completely devegetated, which makes it really difficult to get infiltration by precipitation or even, just your drip irrigation, kind of the supplemental watering programs that a lot of people use. And then, so the biggest things are really soil and then creating shade.
I see.
Kind of creating a more hospitable environment for understory plants. And so a lot of people say trees are kind of the backbone of the landscape. So I really emphasize getting trees in, and this has numerous benefits from, increasing the energy efficiency of the home. A well-placed tree can actually reduce heating and cooling costs throughout the year by, in some cases, more than 25%, which is pretty significant.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah. And then also, at the altitude that we're at, our UV index is very high, which means that the sun, in many cases, in all cases, is going to be much stronger than, somewhere closer to sea level. So when you go to the nursery and you read on the tag that a plant wants full sun, well, here in New Mexico, I've found that that's often not the case, and it's more like a half day sun or even just 2 or 3 hours.
Interesting.
So by setting up that overstory canopy of shade, you allow plants to get either morning or afternoon sun. As the sun is rising or setting, it will come in at an angle underneath the canopy of the tree, and then during the heat of the day, that tree canopy is going to shade those and give them a little bit of a break and, increase moisture retention, reduce evaporation, things like that.
And so in New Mexico, so if someone has basically a weed patch in their yard or they're in the countryside, how much you're going to have to bring in new organic matter, right, to supplement the soil? Is that pretty much
Correct.
always the case? Okay.
Yeah, in most cases, a lot of people can, identify with this. But if you're out hiking or anything like that, you'll notice underneath junipers or pinon or well-established larger plants, you're going to find, and especially trees in this case, you're going to find that the soil has a little bit different quality. It's a little bit darker, a little more rich feeling if you pick it up and rub it between your fingers. It's definitely a rough starting point for landscaping, because most plants at this point have kind of evolved to hold on to most of their organic matter. And if you think about walking through a forest, you're looking at the ground and you see that there is a layer of humus and natural mulch that is falling from deciduous trees and various things growing, dying, decaying, and building that soil. And in the desert, you have cacti and succulents and things like that are really holding on to all of that organic matter. So the soil building process is a lot slower in our location.
People in places like Seattle and probably Minnesota, I'm from Seattle, and you just throw anything in the ground and then it's fine.
Oh,
You don't have to
absolutely.
do anything. And then also lack of water.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that a little bit? Is that part of your strategy as a landscaper?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. You look at the whole water cycle and the way things are kind of happening, and when rain falls, it can fall at pretty hard onto the ground. In some cases, up to 30 kilometers an hour. And so you think about that coming down and making impact with the soil. It's actually, there's a term for it. It's called flocculation. So when a raindrop falls and hits the soil, it will kind of shatter the soil particles and that organic matter down to its kind of bare constituents. When that happens, the minerals tend to sink down to the lowest point and then collect far down as they can infiltrate, which in a lot of cases is not very far. And over time, those minerals will actually build up a layer either on the surface or just below the soil that becomes impermeable. And so by you're talking about weeds and things that a lot of people view as being invasive or kind of nasty and undesirable in the landscape, you're actually doing more damage by clearing those away and leaving bare ground, because you then get, next to no infiltration of natural precipitation. So a big thing that we're doing, obviously compost and kind of revitalizing some of the nutrient levels in the soil, but then mulching is a very important and I would argue just absolutely critical piece of landscaping here in New Mexico. And what that's doing in tandem with, the planting and establishing trees and all of that is covering that soil and protecting it. And so you'll be increasing the level of infiltration when water does arrive. And I think I think a lot of people can identify with that as well. You see a big rainstorm in monsoon season or something like that, and a lot of the water is just running, either to arroyos or the side of the road or whatever it may be. And it's really hard for it to soak in. And so I think that is a big part of our water crisis and climatic situation here in Santa Fe. So, and New Mexico as well.
Interesting. And do you have any insight about the soil food web here locally? Because, I'm very interested in all the different microbes and, all the different components of soil, but what are we dealing with here? A lot of that soil that's really dry, I would imagine. Surely there's fungi in there and microbes.
Right. I think there is, obviously there's some stuff in there, but I think it's just at such a depleted level. Bringing back more biodiversity and all of that is planting and doing all of that is the best way to increase that. I don't know too much about specific, or I haven't researched into it yet, but specific species or things of that nature in our soil. But I do know that trees and especially perennial plants are your best bet for revitalizing the soil, because what happens with the roots of plants is they're going to be secreting kind of sticky carbohydrates and sugary substances that are going to feed the microorganisms. And then what happens as the microorganisms are attracted to that is they, obviously they contain water, they're living organisms, and they're also coated with a watery membrane around the outside of them.
Right.
And so they will create more porous space in the soil. So just the act of putting roots into the ground will over time increase the soil's ability to hold water.
Yes, that seems so critical.
Absolutely.
And so when you're talking to people, I'm sure that a lot of your customers in Santa Fe are savvy and they know about the soil food web and they know about simple methods to improve their landscape. But how do you convert people who aren't there yet? They are pouring chemicals in their yard. They don't understand how the ecosystem works.
Yeah. Well, I kind of, one way that you can approach it is everybody speaks the language of money. So you can approach it from a financial standpoint, and you can tell them, look, you can either put this mulch down and this compost and then plant into it and start building your organic matter and your soil health naturally and let nature do the work. Or you can continue to spraying chemicals on weeds and have a really tough time of keeping everything under control and, putting fertilizers in and all of that. But why not save yourself the money and just take the step in the right direction right off the bat by just trying to revegetate? I think that's a lot of people understand that. And then especially there's the whole kind of the gravel lovers and the mulch lovers. There's a lot of people really like the aesthetic of gravel. And when you kind of just break it down for people, like if you think about gravel, it does increase your drainage, but you're not building any soil. Like soil will actually start to build on top of gravel. And so when people are putting down weed barrier and then a couple inches of gravel, yeah, that's great. It's protecting the soil and all of that. But the weeds that you're going to find germinating are usually more pioneer species like your Russian thistle or tumbleweed, kochia, all of those type of things. They're wind-borne seeds.
Yes.
So what's going to happen is over time, the dust is going to blow in, or leaves and plant matter will decompose in the gravel, creating kind of a home that most plants will not find desirable, but those pioneer species just love it. That's kind of their ecological role is the first movers. And so you'll find weeds still popping up where you have weed barrier and gravel, but you're not going to get as many of the, wildflowers and native plants and things like that establishing because it's just not that hospitable. So I find that mulch is much more conducive to weed suppression and, as far as maintenance and things like that as well. If you're hiring a landscaping company to come and clean your gravel and get all the organic matter out of your gravel, some people, you have to do it, every other week or so.
I see.
And with mulch, you can always just, like, we like to just pull weeds, drop them right where we pull them out of. And when the mulch needs a refresh, you just bring in a little more mulch and put it down on top. And then you've just added another layer that will eventually decompose into organic matter.
As far as like the whole movement around xeriscaping, I think that's partly what you were talking about.
Yeah.
I personally, being more involved in soil, am interested in the mulch and the components of the soil. What is going on with xeriscaping? Well,
I think there's been a little bit of a shift. I know that there was a recent, I think it was some sort of Xeriscape Council summit or something like that, but the focus was on creating shade canopies and things like that. So, I think that it makes sense in one way because you are using less water, and putting down the gravel it looks nice and clean. It's very aesthetically pleasing to the human eye. Mm-hmm. But I think that people are starting to realize that, increasing soil life and soil health and actually creating more shade and more things that are deciduous, meaning they're dropping leaves in the fall, and then, leafing back out in the spring, is more beneficial in the long run, as opposed to doing the gravel and cacti and, kind of the minimalist type deal.
Xeriscaping is basically under-delivered, and people are starting to figure that out.
Yeah. And I think, I'm not really sure what the origin of the gravel aesthetic came from. It might just be, resource availability. There's not that many trees in New Mexico, to make mulch and all of that stuff. And we have most certainly plenty of rock. So
Yeah.
that might be part of it. Oh, and then one other thing that I point out to people with gravel is that it's going to create a lot more heat in the yard. So there's a lot of plants that, don't like that root zone being heated up in that way and all of that. And it actually can increase your energy bill for your home if your entire yard is graveled rather than mulched. So that's another kind of.
That makes sense as far as summer, like air conditioning maybe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the winter, maybe in New Mexico with a house that's poorly insulated, that could help.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay. What about for watering? I mean, a lot of people I see have the different types of irrigation using rain catchment. What is the most common thing that people are doing? And then also, what would you recommend, like as far as cost goes? And like, what does it cost to even set up a system?
Right. So I think, a lot of people are moving to drip, and that's the little emitters where the water's actually dripping out. You have various forms of micro sprayers, pop-up sprinklers, and then the hand watering folks who like to go out with the hose. And a lot of people find that pretty cathartic to go out and
be with their plants.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is great. But, if you could save that time and just go sit and do nothing and enjoy the plants, I would argue that might be a little more enjoyable. Best way, what I'm recommending for folks, if you bury lines too deep and then you do end up having a leak of some form, it's very hard to detect when it's buried. So I actually recommend doing drip lines on the surface of the ground and then mulching over the top of it. So you still get that reduced evaporation effect from the mulch cover, but you're also able to detect leaks, should they happen. I would say as far as cost goes, the most costly aspect of it is the labor. It's the install and the knowledge that comes with putting together a drip system. But parts really are not that expensive. So you can get, probably for your average home in Santa Fe, depending on how many zones and how specific you want to get, because you can have trees on one zone, shrubs on another, that type of deal.
Right.
It's probably, within the $500 to $600 range, I would say.
Just to install it, huh?
Just to install it.
That's so reasonable.
Yeah. So, a lot of people, I think, get worked up about it and they think it's going to be thousands of dollars and all that. And yes, if you do have a big property, it can be, but there's some statistics out there that are saying you can save almost 70% of the water that you were normally using hand watering if you're just doing drip. Because
it appeals more than just financially. If we really do have a shortage of water here, which some people say is absolutely a fact, then that's a big deal. We need to be doing that.
Right. Yeah. So the other thing I was going to mention was by using a drip system, you are going to reduce overall maintenance costs for the property as well, because you're not just like with a pop-up sprinkler, you're covering the whole yard and you're soaking all the soil, it's great to get that moisture into the soil, but you're also going to have a much higher rate of undesirable germination from weed species. So with that targeted dripping action, you're just getting it directly, to the roots. You can adjust where the water's going in. And it's also more beneficial for the plant because it's a slower, deeper watering effect than flooding it out with a hose and then letting it soak in and maybe flooding it again. So we are kind of a full spectrum landscaping company. We do everything from design, installation, maintenance, consultation. We can just meet with you. And if you want to talk ideas about your property or just get kind of a drawing of some ideas or concepts that you might be able to put into effect if you're a do-it-yourselfer, which I absolutely encourage. My goal with 100% of my customers is to get them in the yard, get them involved. It's very nourishing to the human spirit.
Yeah, it makes all the difference in the world when you see someone's yard where they really are emotionally invested in it. It gets really fun. I think it changes people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. There's all sorts of different, programs now. They're putting gardening programs into prisons and schools, elderly care homes and things like that. It's very proven to make you overall happier.
People were saying that you really got to find good gloves. And I said, I need to be putting my hands into the soil. It's going to ruin my fingers, but I still need to be doing that. It makes me feel so good.
I'm the same way. I'm the same way. You rarely will find me with gloves on unless I'm, removing tumbleweed or choya or something like that. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
And what about the under the soil stuff? So in more moist locations, I think it's probably more common that someone might have a parasitic nematode or some other thing going on, or like a fungal problem. What do we run into here? And then also, how do we fix it?
So a couple of things that I've seen are like ground aphids and some different fungi, and kind of my approach to that is to add more. There's a lot of different microbial solutions, granules, powders, all these different things, but I really try to when we're doing the initial planting, put those beneficial items in there with the root mass, and just get them established from the get-go.
So when you're talking about putting those components into the soil, are you talking mainly about the different minerals that are going to attract the microbes, or are you talking about the compost which already has a micro?
Well, I would do both. They make kind of like mycorrhizal supplements. And so if you're planting and you want to do soil amendments in the hole that the tree's going into, they'll make like this little granule that is just concentrated mycorrhizal extracts, I guess you will, if you will. And then as you water them in, they'll kind of wake up and get going and start to associate with those trees' roots, develop over time. But yeah, so we do a little bit of both. We definitely add, obviously, some nutrients because the soil's quite depleted in that department, but also adding the physical mycorrhizae. And most of these things will have a wide range of species. And so you're pretty well covered as far as putting things in that will be able to adapt here in New Mexico.
That's amazing, because the more I read about the exudates and the mycorrhizal fungus connection that happens, every tree has a completely different one, it seems like. Right. So they've got the products already that...
Yeah. And they make some that are, a little bit more kind of like broadacre broadcasting type deals where you'll mix them into 100 gallons and then do a spray application on everything and then mulch over the top of that. But I've also found that you can really get some awesome colonization happening just by putting down wood chip mulch.
Oh yeah.
So if you go back, within a couple months, you'll pull those wood chips apart and just see all this white network, the mycorrhizae doing their thing. So that's another factor with the mulch, is that it feeds that whole community that we don't always think about or see, but they're definitely there. So.
And you originally mentioned that cell membrane of the bacteria. I mean, that's where a lot of the moisture is held, right? So that's a great thing to be doing.
Yeah, no, it definitely should be a priority, because just by them being, and usually they'll, like you were saying, associate with specific plants. So creating the greatest amount of biodiversity in your landscape plant wise will also then in turn create the greatest amount of biodiversity below the soil. So you're just kind of bringing in all hands on deck and giving everybody a piece of the landscape.
That's awesome. And would you say that most people don't know about this stuff? Most of your customers that you're dealing with?
I think it's less talked about. Yeah, I think definitely it's one area, we don't really think about soil health. I mean, you think about soil health in general, but then you don't really know what to do about it. It's just like put in more compost and, more nutrients or whatever. But, I have noticed that there's a lot of great programs going on here in Santa Fe and elsewhere that are doing a great job of educating people, like the Master Gardeners Association and all of that. So I have gotten a few new clients where they're already well versed on this stuff, and I'm kind of like, oh, awesome! Like I don't have to give you the spiel on everything.
That's good.
We're already on the same page. So yeah, I think it's definitely a growing awareness, which rightly so. It's very important. So
great. Well, I guess one other question that I kind of had on the back burner was about like native grasses or ornamental grasses. Maybe they're not native, but I know that they can put, their rhizomes, and they put a root down so far. I mean, they can pull up so many nutrients and also contain a lot of moisture, probably with the fungus too.
Right.
What do you know about grasses, and how do you use them?
So grasses are really nice when you have a little bit broader acreage. If you want to establish a meadow or things like that, wildflowers and grasses are a great way to go. I do tend to recommend trees, especially shade trees, more so than grasses, just because I think the benefits are a little bit more numerous with trees. But, grasses are definitely a close second. Like you were saying, they have quite deep roots and very fibrous roots. So they're very good for erosion control if you have a steep slope or something like that. But, trees just kind of create that bigger area of shade and support more layers of biodiversity beneath them. Whereas grasses, it's kind of, you put the grasses in, they fill in, and you can have wildflowers and things like that in there, but it's not a whole lot of room for a ton of evolution. So if that makes sense. So
yeah. And what about aspen trees? I know they're really popular, but people have so many problems with their aspen trees.
They are just way below their elevation. They really want to be up in the mountains. And so one thing I would say, if you absolutely need an aspen tree, and that's like your one thing that you want to have to look at in your yard, plant them in groups, because they are their community plant. Like if you look at, the groves up especially in the Santa Fe ski basin, those are a lot of those are just one big organism. They spread through their roots, and they put very little energy into self-defense. Kind of what happens is when an aspen gets into trouble, it goes into automatic reproduction mode. So you'll often see a plant that is infected with something, cytospora or aphids or black spot, and then it's putting up all these little baby aspens around it. And so I encourage people to either, if it's bad enough, remove the tree. Otherwise, you could do things like Super Thrive, which is kind of like a general multivitamin fertilizer that's low dosages of a lot of different things, and it'll kind of help balance the nutrients out for the tree and increase its ability to fight back. But really, you just want to let those little guys grow up, because they're just trying to help and make the organism a little bigger. So they tend to fare better. I'd recommend planting them on the north side of the house, where they're getting a little bit of a break from the sun. It's a huge headache to have to maintain either specific supplement regimens of nutrients, or constantly spraying them with fungicides or insecticides, and it can be a huge cost to own aspens. So I typically just steer people clear of those from the get-go. But I don't have anything against the tree. They're absolutely gorgeous, and I love them. But I do think that things should be planted where appropriate. And if you go too far outside of those parameters, then you're just going to be asking for a maintenance nightmare. So
makes sense. Originally, when we connected, I was really curious about biodynamic farming. I know you said that's not your expertise, but I am curious if you want to speak in whatever capacity you can.
Sure.
Other out there things.
I got into permaculture originally, kind of from the big university horticulture scene, and then through a friend and an extended stay living down in Costa Rica, I was exposed to this concept of permaculture and looking at things more holistically, and just the bigger picture of everything. Was then introduced from my significant other to biodynamics. She was a Waldorf student, so very involved the philosophies and teachings of Rudolf Steiner, who is kind of the founder of biodynamics. And it's just very holistic. It has you look at a piece of land or a farm or someone's landscape as a full-blown organism. So you have from the microbes to the trees to the plants that visit your yard. All of these things are interacting either through different energy or nutrient exchanges and different ways of benefiting each other. And so I've found that biodynamics is just so cool, because it emphasizes, and the goal is to create this new vitality and foster all of these relationships between the different aspects of this whole organism. It's almost, what is that word, terroir, that they use with wine, which is kind of that uniqueness of place. And biodynamics is very much in the same boat as that concept, where you have unique living organism that is your land. All of those things are interacting and sharing energies and all of that in a specific way. So if you think about it, like you have a flower growing, and then a rabbit eats the flower, and then the rabbit poops out the waste, and that waste contains both the essence of the flower to some extent and the essence of the animal. And then that goes back into the land. And so you're kind of creating this concentration of events happening and organisms happening on your land.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that they took it to that level.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little out there for some people. It can seem a little woo-woo, but I had the opportunity to attend the International Biodynamic Conference. I guess it was 3 years ago now. It was hosted in Santa Fe. And, I was sitting in some of these lectures and, it's pretty out there stuff. Like there's a lot of these different preparations that are called for, and it usually consists of some part of an animal and some part of a plant, and you combine those things, and then you're using kind of the cosmic cycles and lunar cycles and burying those on, like let's say on the summer solstice, and then you dig it up on the winter solstice or things like that. So it's very much
very ritualistic.
Yes. But then, so I'm sitting in this course and I'm sitting next to this gentleman and they're going over an overview of all of the different preparations. And I have this look on my face, and the guy must have seen it because he looked over at me and he was like, "You're not buying it, are you?" And I was like, it's a little out there for me. It seems a little bit woo woo or whatever. And he was like, "Well, I felt the same way. And I'm an apple grower in upstate New York. And I was like very skeptical of all of this until several years in a row, he was a biodynamic practitioner and applying these preparations on his orchards. There were several years where there's one preparation that uses a part of the valerian plant, which is supposed to have warming properties. And so it's supposed to be a frost protection spray that you would apply the night before a late freeze, and it'll, in theory, protect your blooms. And he was telling me that all of those years where they had these random late freezes and more erratic weather patterns, like 95% of his competition didn't have apples that year, and he had apples.
It's amazing.
So he was using these preparations, and it was working for him. So he was like, I'm coming at it from a practical sense. I'm a businessman. I need to make a profit and feed my family and all of that. And this stuff works. So at that point I was kind of like, this is interesting. Someone who's not super out there personality wise, but more practical and maybe a little more grounded, still sees a lot of value in this.
Well, that's very cool. I think it'll definitely be appealing to many people in this area who happen to be woo-woo. And even if they're not, I do think that it's great that it makes people think about it all in a very different way, because that's how we figure out how to balance our planet. If it is just ritual, at least people are really thinking outside of the box and getting into their yards in a different way. Indigenous people have been using lunar cycles forever, so maybe
right.
It just connects people to that a little better.
Well, and another interesting thing at this conference, there was a team up from Mexico that were also, giving a presentation, and they were talking about, some of the older indigenous peoples of that area of Central America. It's almost an exact parallel of these preparations that Steiner, who was from Europe, came up with. They were doing it, but with their available resources. So where it was cow manure in a cow horn being buried, it was goat manure in a coconut or something like that. So it was using their available resources, but for the same end goal. And it was almost an exact, I believe it was Aztec people. I might be mistaken. It was Aztec or Mayan. But, so there's these records of this stuff going on in different areas of the world and boasting the same effects or the same intent. So
amazing.
That was pretty interesting.
You've introduced people to what it is, because I think most people have no idea.
Right. It's some dense stuff, but I would encourage you to just maybe look up a couple books. They've got a lot of different introductory kind of texts on the subject. And there's also a local Southwest biodynamic group that meets at the Santa Fe Waldorf School.
Oh, okay.
And so, I've gotten involved with that. And I'm also a member of the Biodynamic Association, kind of the umbrella association. But so we'll meet a couple times a year and we do the different preps, and we make enough for everybody to have some. And I think it's only like $20 to just to kind of cover materials and things like that. But really cool group of people, and a lot of those people have been practicing this and studying this for longer than I've been alive, for 30 or 40 years. So a lot more knowledgeable than myself.
And a lot of them are farmers.
Yes, Melinda Bateman is kind of the organizer for that group, and she runs a farm up in Taos called Morningstar Farm.
Okay.
Believe she's Demeter certified, which is kind of like the organic certification equivalent for biodynamics. Yeah, so a lot of these folks either have, a home scale farm or a homestead, or they're just interested in it. I know that there's one couple who has like a cosmetics company, but they have, I think, some vineyards out towards Abiquiu.
Oh,
Um,
neat.
but it's gotten huge, especially in the wine community, the biodynamic
They figured out that those subtle
practices.
energies really affect the grapes, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And there's a lot of the, wine tasters or aficionados that claim that it makes a huge difference and you can taste it. So it's very interesting stuff.
Wow, no kidding.
So we were kind of talking about, soil and the interaction and relationship with trees and perennials and deeper rooted plants.
Yeah.
And I just actually through the Biodynamic Association just participated in a webinar that was very enlightening as far as the weather patterns that we're seeing now and the correlation between that and the level of devegetation that's happening on the earth as a whole.
Uh-huh.
Devegetation and soil erosion. I'm sure everybody knows or has noticed that it's a little windy this year. One thing that's happening with that is, as you devegetate, so you think about the water cycle, the water evaporates off the ocean and it starts moving inland, and then it will condense and rain, and then trees will, in an ideal situation, it'll hit a forest and rain. The trees will evapotranspire the water back up. And so it kind of creates this circling movement of up and down, and it almost leapfrogs from planted area to planted area where it can get that regeneration of water to form more clouds and continue inland. So when you have a vast devegetated area, that doesn't really happen. You end up getting these huge buildups, which, we're seeing right now, especially on the coasts with all the hurricanes and large storm events. Basically what's happening is you're getting a huge rain event on a devegetated area, and then you're getting a mass evaporation event. And due to the heat that's going on, the water's going higher, and then it goes farther away. That change in temperature, like the very great change in temperatures that we're seeing right now is causing this wind to come in. But that's kind of where a lot of that is coming from. And so revegetating the landscape and doing trees and perennials and water catchment and all of that is going to help moderate temperatures and therefore moderate weather events, create a little bit more stability. And so I really think that
makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, in the high desert areas,
just maintaining that moisture helps so much. But I mean, it sounds like it's also a worldwide movement. We have to, as a species, just evolve our practices so that we're not, 20th century farming brought us forward, but now that's over. We need to figure out what's next.
Right. And so just kind of taking a little lesson from the way nature structures itself and trying to replicate in the landscape, the human created landscape. You can do an intelligent design and then manage that, but you really want to mimic nature and the way that happens as much as possible and create, your overstory layer of trees and then maybe some smaller trees and shrubs and ground covers and all, but you want all the different layers of plants that occur in nature to be ideally in your yard. And I think you'll see the lasting effects. And sometimes it takes a little while for everything to kick in, and you do have to do supplemental irrigation and all of that stuff. A little bit of planning goes a long way as far as landscaping. So
that's awesome. And I've heard people say it takes 13 years to make a landscape.
Yeah. It's usually with permaculture design and that, a lot of people will say that it pops after 7 or 8 years, and you'll really start to see the benefits of a well thought out planting. We try to do things like nitrogen fixers for fruit trees so that you'll have better fruit set. And like dandelions are very beneficial to fruit trees. They produce, I believe it's ethylene from the blooms, and it will encourage the fruit to set. We're in kind of a rough spot right now. The weather's getting more erratic, and I think everybody's really feeling that this season as far as the heat and temperature fluctuations and the lack of moisture and all of that. And so I think that, if we get planting and get things in the ground, that we can really make a difference. And also erosion as well is another huge point that we need to address here in Santa Fe, because a lot of people design their yards to shed water. And when you do that, you're washing your topsoil away, and it's becoming an issue for someone else down the food chain, if you will, or down that flow of water. So I think they're estimating right now that the earth is losing about 1% of our global topsoil per year. And we've lost about 50% of global topsoil in the last 150 years.
Amazing.
So it's looking a little bit bleak in that, they're saying in the next 60 years, there might not be topsoil left to plant into. I think we've lost 30% of arable land, like farmable land, in the last 50 years.
I personally have a lot of faith in the microbes and the fungi that they're working with, but I think that it's going to be saving us at the last minute, maybe.
Yeah. Well, and that's, it's another kind of saving grace of mulch, is it's protecting your soil and it's keeping it where it is. Doing all of that, like berms and swales, passive rainwater catchment, all of that is just, it's, kind of the best case scenario as far as how we can address these issues.
That's great information. How can people reach you if they're local and they want to have your consultation or something?
Yes. So I can be reached at futuerootslandscapes with an S at gmail.com. And then my personal number, it's a Madison area code still. I haven't switched over, but 608-212-3311.
All right. Well, very nice to meet you, John. Thank you so much. I appreciate all your thoughtful answers.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me, Aaron.